Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Wa alaikum assalam. How are you doing?
Alhamdulillah, how are you?
Good. Thank you. Alhamdulillah.
For some bizarre reason, my video is not working. So sorry, Javed, I can't show myself to you.
That's okay. Maybe next time. Assalamu alaikum. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Glad to have you. So I actually wanted to use these couple minutes before class begins. Just make sure that muted. So I wanted to use these couple minutes to show couple of the video responses. It's quite nice that people did these.
Mm-hmm.
So this one is by Umair.
So much about few classes.
And I do speed up the videos, as you can see. I watch everything on 2 times. Let me know if this is too fast. So this is Umair.
Learning so much about few classes of the Islamic intellectual history. You are a great teacher, and I am so happy that I am taking your class. I think every student of religion should take this class, and I hope every student of religion this class would be beneficial for him or her. Thank you.
That's an A+ right there. So thank you very much. And then Khurram gave this very thoughtful response.
Hello, assalamu alaikum, Dr. Javed and my fellow classmates, representatives from Al-Mawrid. Thank you so much for making this course happen. I'm benefiting a lot. I really appreciate it. I also really appreciate the deep dive additional videos.
Okay, I will go to 1.5.
They address questions that were coming up for me, and yeah, I kind of preempted them and have given me new material to chew on. I think very well done. I appreciate it a lot. A couple of, I guess, I don't know if these are questions or not, or if they're manageable or not, but so maybe we'll just take them as comments, and Doctor, you can proceed as you see fit. I'll say I have 4 here. First one is, where's the space to recognize perennialism or universal salvation, but still maintain some idea of Islam's exceptionalism beyond the idea that Islam is just the new kid on the block, the newest formation of monotheism. I guess to paraphrase Lampe, as you quoted on slide 66 of lecture 1, is there a healthy bifurcation possible? Second point, regarding the question of reform, and we had a slide that generated a lot of discussion, the reforms of Umar ibn Khattab, radiallahu anhu.
So actually, I'm going to.
I could not figure out what he was saying. So what's the gist of his question?
I think I'm going to play it in the
Okay.
break. So
okay,
now.
Cool.
Welcome from Afghanistan. Wow, amazing. Okay, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We are beginning lecture number 3. We're starting right on time. All right, right off the bat, please do make a donation, a small donation. All right, and this is our topic today. I'm very excited with our topic, Sufism Mazhab of love and mystical experience. Am I good to go as far as the Ghamidi Center team is concerned?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay, great. So just some housekeeping. Again, consider that small donation. Here's the Google Classroom to join. That's the code. That has been a great resource for us. And you can post questions or comments on there. Also, upload video responses on YouTube or whatever platform you can put it up on. I'm encouraging you to do that, just a 5-minute video, what you think about the class, or the material, any questions or comments you might have. We'll share a couple of those videos in the break. And I did change my YouTube URL and name because I know many people were having a hard time finding it. So it's now Dr. Javed T. Hashmi. There was another Javed Hashmi masquerading around. So, all right, so we will begin. I apologize if I'm a little bit on the sluggish side today. I did work a overnight shift last night. So, all right, we're gonna recap now. From lecture 1, in lecture 1, we talked about the formative period of Islam and the Quranic turn or trajectory. We talked about how the Quran called away from jahl to hilm, or from barbarity to civility, from idolatry to radical monotheism, and from tribal to universal ethics. We saw how the Quran created the individual even as it stressed the importance of social justice. In lecture 2, we talked about Sunni Islam and the triumph of traditionism. We saw how the early caliphs, such as Umar, actively engaged with the Quran and viewed Sunnah as something living and dynamic. We saw how the proto-Malikis stressed the Sunnah as a lived tradition, and the Hanafis, or the proto-Hanafis, and the people of opinion relied on human reason, or aql. We saw how Imam Shafi'i sided with the Hanbalis and the Ahl Hadith, the traditionists, and tipped the scales in favor of hadith and textual report, or naql. And we saw how Sunni Islam would come to view human reason, aql, with suspicion. Hadith became preponderant, and Islamic law, or sharia, became the prominent edifice of knowledge. But we'll see in this lecture how Sufis will see beyond text and law and speak of mystical experience and love. In the upcoming lecture, lecture number 4, we'll see how Shias will see in the Imams of Ahl Bayt a living political, religious, and spiritual authority. And in lecture 5, we'll come to the Mu'tazilis, or the rationalists, and the Islamic philosophers who will stress the importance of human reason, aql, and embrace philosophy and science, resulting in the famed, quote unquote, golden age of Islam. So that's the upcoming lectures as I plan them. The general theme of these few lectures is the same, that after the death of the Prophet in 632 CE, there was a sudden vacuum in socio-political, religious, and spiritual authority. And Muslim groups of virtually all groups and sects sought to replace and extend prophetic authority in these various aspects. So we saw, again, this is all review, in Sunni Islam, we saw how the caliphs eventually came to take political authority, even though in the beginning they claimed all 3, but eventually they had to settle on just political authority. The ulama, or the religious clerics, the religious establishment, took religious authority. And in this lecture, we'll see how the Sufis, or the mystics, took spiritual and charismatic authority. Now, when we talk about Sufi Islam, or Sufism, we all come in with our own preconceptions of what Sufism is. Views towards Sufism, I think, can be very polarized. Either Sufism is aberrant and wholly un-Islamic in origin, or else Sufism is portrayed as the exact right kind of Islam and the solution to all the woes of the modern Islamic world. My view on this, well, I do come, I must admit, from the first camp. That's where I originated in the more kind of critical approach to Sufism. But the honest truth is, the more I study the Sufi tradition, the more I start to appreciate at least certain aspects of it. My position towards Sufism remains, like much else I study, ambivalent. Although I continue to find certain aspects problematic, I find other elements of Sufism to be irresistible. For the most part, however, here I will try to present a charitable impression of Sufism and simply ask you to keep your critical thinking cap on. Near the end, I will do what's called the last chapter syndrome, in which I will kind of weigh in on my viewpoint, but you are free to disagree. I'm not here trying to impose my view on you. Near the end of this part one, we will look at Ghamidi Saab's critique, as well as some critiques that I have, and then I'll also discuss certain aspects that I find very positive. But again, you don't need to agree with that. And if you find that completely unacceptable, you can tune out when I talk about my own viewpoints. All right, so what is mysticism? It refers to spiritual union and experiential knowledge of the divine, which is simultaneously ineffable, yet universally present in all religious traditions. So this is a definition that I got just from a resource online. But even though we use that kind of, general definition, I think we should resist being essentialist. That is, we should resist the urge to consider Sufism as some sort of vague, primordial, and self-evident mysticism. Instead, Sufism is to be understood as a specific form or forms of mystical practice that has its own historical tradition. In other words, we can study Sufi thought within its particular historical context or contexts. That is to say, I'm saying that Sufism is not just this vague general idea out there, but there is actually a specific historical tradition which we are going to study in this lecture. As far as the origins of Sufism, a practice of zuhud or asceticism can be traced back to at least the 2nd century AH, that is after Hijrah. Initially, in the first few centuries, I will be using Hijri dates, but after basically the turn of the millennium, I'm going to be switching to CE or AD, the Common Era, and I will let you know when I do that. Now, at this early stage, Sufism is not a single homogeneous movement, but there is a group that emerges in Baghdad in the 3rd century, which goes by the name of Sufism or Sufis. They were renunciates outside Baghdad as well, eventually, and by the 4th century, these movements link up under one umbrella that we can call Sufism. So you have all of these disparate groups, but eventually they all come under one umbrella. Of course, Sufis themselves trace their origin back to the Prophet Muhammad and to the Sahaba or the Prophet's companions, especially to Ali ibn Abi Talib. So most of the Sufi tariqas go back to Ali, with the exception of the Naqshbandis, which we'll talk about, which trace their lineage to Abu Bakr. Now, as far as the name Sufi, there are different theories about where the name comes from. The Arabic term for Sufism, by the way, is tasawwuf, which literally means to become a Sufi, which is a little bit of a philosophical idea in that. It seems, well, at least the most popular view is that the word comes from suf, which means wool, because the early Sufis used to wear these rough woolen garments, which represented the ascetic ideal, as you see in the picture. Some Sufis also link it to the Arabic word sufa or bench, referring to the companions of the bench. These were companions of the prophets who were on the poorer side and who used to sit near the prophet in Medina on this bench, and they were a very pious group of people. Be aware that Sufism does not refer to another sect of Islam, in contradistinction to Sunnism and Shiism. That is, some people think it's Sunni, Shia, and Sufi as if these are 3 different categories, but rather Sufism is a trend and religious order or tariqa within mostly Sunni Islam. There is some overlap with Shia Islam as well, especially when it comes to the key concept of wilaya or walaya, which we'll see next lecture is a Shi'i concept. And Shias also have this concept of irfan or gnosis, which we can kind of think as a corollary of Sufism. So when I say that that Sunnism and Sufism are not 2 completely separate concepts, I want to point out that a person can, for example, be Sunni, a Hanafi by legal school. We talked about legal schools last lecture. A Maturidi by theological school. We haven't talked about theological schools yet. That's Kalam. We're going to talk about that hopefully next week. And a Sufi of the Naqshbandi mystical order. So you can think of this as a Venn diagram, and you can fall into all of these different groups. For the last 1,000 years, Sufism has been melded together with Sunni Islam, with a surprising number of Islamic scholars belonging, at least nominally, to a Sufi order. Most surprising, I found, was that even a scholar like Ibn Taymiyyah, who takes a very critical stance towards Sufism and is very popular for that, is supposedly part of a Sufi order himself. So that I find very interesting. It seems to be a modern phenomenon that Sufism loses much of its influence, and people, including many Muslims, start to think of it as something marginal. Now, I'm not making any value statements here. These are just statements of kind of historical record. Whether or not we see these as Islamic with a capital I in our opinion, that is up to each individual to make that decision. But here I'm viewing it as an academic historian. I'm saying that clearly Sufism is a part of our historical tradition. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, I leave that up to you. All right, let's start our historical record. We go back all the way to the 3rd century to Al-Kharaz. And I'm going to be just putting out names there. You obviously can't remember all of them, but again, I'm trying to contextualize. So we're going to see historical figures, but we're also dealing with these issues thematically. So we see that he was a cobbler by profession, so he was from the lower class. He called towards this inward turn to mystically experience God's unity. This is called ma'rifah, and this is a key Sufi concept where we want to know God, but we want to know God on this mystical or spiritual level, not on this intellectual level. We want to attain proximity with God. And in order to do that, there was this concept that we need to lose our worldly attachments and our own attributes, our own selfhood, so that we can then become perpetually absorbed in God's majesty. This is the concept of fana, as we will see. So to pass away from the self, that's fana, and to subsist or persist, baqa, in God. Now, whether or not these terms exist formally at this time or not, we're not sure, but clearly these ideas or the kind of the germination of this idea is present. Speaking of, we have this kind of scribble on the slides. If we could see if those could be removed, if the Ghamidi Center team could do that, I appreciate that. All right, so Sufism is about the spiritual journey. It's a path, a spiritual path. That's why it's called tariqa, marked by various stopping places, stations, maqam, and states. That is, each person travels through, the idea is that each person travels through different stations of spiritual hierarchy. And based on where each individual is on that spiritual hierarchy, Sufis had this idea that we could actually classify human beings that way. So on the lowest rung were those who choose this world over the next. A little higher than them are those who obey God, but they do so out of fear of punishment. And then maybe a little bit higher than them are those who do so out of desire for reward in the hereafter. And then above them are those who orient their spirits towards God out of love for him. So we're gonna see this concept recurrently, where Sufis are saying that we should obey and love God for his sake and his sake alone, as opposed to simply fear of punishment or reward in the hereafter. So we see an early Sufi mystic, Rabia of Basra, and we're going to see a lot of these early Sufi mystics were actually females. And she has this very famous quote. I'm sure you've heard of this, or you may not have, but she said, "O Lord, if I worship you because of fear of hell, then burn me in hell. If I worship you because I desire paradise, then exclude me from paradise. But if I worship you for yourself alone, then deny me not your eternal beauty." And there are different variations of this famous passage. And you see here the image of Rabia, in which she has a pot of water and a stick with fire, and she's going around the village and saying that she is going to put water on the fire of hell, and she's going to light paradise on fire. And the whole idea is that we should just focus on God instead of just these rewards or punishments. So that's definitely an interesting idea that is recurrent in Sufism. And speaking of, if you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand. We want to encourage video questions as well as in the text chat, and you can do both. You can text, I have a question, and you please feel free to message those to the moderator who has asked me questions. That's actually my sister, Sarah. I do want to thank her for doing the great moderation. It really helps me a lot. All right, so we have these different stages of spirituality. So how do we ascend these different stages? Well, the first thing is that we, according to this Sufi conception, is that we have to cut off our worldly attachments. That's why there is this asceticism and this desire for poverty, because the materialistic goods of this world will distract you from this spiritual journey. There's also this concept of avoidance of the active search for sustenance. That is, they're not completely against seeking means of your provisions of this world, but you shouldn't actively search for it. So very early on, there's this idea of extreme piety and virtue, that we need to be sincere for God, and that we should remember God through dhikr, or that's the spiritual recitation, and mystical experience. And we'll definitely talk about mystical experience. We have a question about how Sufism started. I am basically getting into how Sufism started here. As you notice, I generally stay away from origins as far as external origins of something. The reason is I'm trying to approach this from an academic standpoint. From a, usually traditional religious methodology, it's common to kind of associate any rival sect or group to an external source. And usually you see, so for example, next lecture, we're going to talk about Shiism. Sunnis will generally teach in their madrasas that Shiism started all from one individual, Abdullah ibn Sabah, and he was a Jew, by the way, and he was conspiring against Islam, and he comes to teach this message, and that's to corrupt Islam, and that's the origin of Shiism. That is very polemical and probably unlikely, right? To attribute all things that you don't like to some foreign influence, and whatever you are on, that's from a divine source and pure. I take the view that it's for almost every group, it's a combination of internal and external factors. What the external factors are, we can kind of, we'll talk about that later, but it's an ongoing thing. So it's not like external factors are just in the beginning phase. In all groups, there are always external factors. Even as we saw last week in Sunni Islam, in traditionism, there is this external factor as well. So Muslims are expanding into the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire, and they are looking at the administration, how they're running things, and that's affecting how they are viewing things. So that's what I would say. I'm just going into beginnings as opposed to origins. I did use the term origins, but really I'm just talking about the beginnings of Sufism. All right, so we talked about the 3 stages on the spiritual path. There is, however, a 4th stage, and the 4th stage is really what Sufis are aiming for. So that's the problem with the 3rd stage, is that people on the 3rd stage are still preoccupied with the stages or the stations on the path. And thus they are veiled from and distracted from the truth, al-haq. So we will see there is this kind of, if you've read like Zen Buddhism or Buddhist material, there's this kind of, in Sufism, there is this interest in kind of what I call word play. So you should go on the spiritual path and ascend the stages, but you should also not think about this path and the stages. we'll see a lot of wordplay in Sufism. But that fourth stage that you really should be aiming for, that fourth stage is for those people who are blinded to themselves and they're plunged into a state of ecstasy, mystical ecstasy, where they are rendered close to God. So that's that highest stage that we should seek. That is the ultimate objective. Once you reach that stage, you get to know God. But this knowing God is not on the intellectual level, but rather in that spiritual level. It's not the brain or the mind, but the heart. And the heart itself is said to have 4 layers. And each layer, we kind of get into this deeper and deeper level. And the highest level is to get into that deepest inner heart. And then once you do that, you can unite with that divine presence. Interestingly, Sufis did not think that this was done by your own human effort. Only God can take one to this state. It's a grace that God bestows upon some servants, and that's how people ascend the different stages. So here's another early Sufi, the same Sufi mystic, I'm sorry, but another quote by him. If you ask anyone who is in this state, what do you want? This is when you're at that 4th stage. He responds, God. And if you ask him, what do you say? He replies, God. If you ask him, what do you know? He replies, God. He is of God, by God, for God, and with God. He has lost his identity and has no bearings. If you ask him, who are you? He cannot even reply, I, myself, because of the domination of divine secrets on him. Such is the reality of ecstasy or of finding. When he attains the zenith of proximity, he can no longer say even God. So we see here that it's almost like a God intoxication, and they will actually use the term intoxication, as we will see. So very early on, there was a Sufi mystic called Al-Hallaj. I'm sure you've heard of him. He was famously executed for saying, I am the truth. And this was considered to be blasphemous. Now, scholars have now put doubt as to, and have said that probably he wasn't killed for this statement, and that story is probably legendary. He was killed for another religious belief of his. And by the way, historically, this was a very rare thing for Sufi mystics or philosophers to be put to death. But this is one of those examples. Now, Sufis consider such statements when somebody says something like this to be an ecstatic utterance. The Arabic term is shat. And often they excuse these utterances. Even though they may seem blasphemous, they argue that the person who reaches this 4th level can get into a state of ecstasy where they're intoxicated with God and they lose their mind. And because they lose their mind, the law or the Sharia at that moment, at that particular moment, no longer applies to them. And so there is this kind of excusing of their statement. The other thing is that they argue that most average human beings simply don't understand what that statement even means. What Hallaj is saying at this time, they argue, is that there is no reality besides God. So it's not shirk in their viewpoint. In fact, it's the opposite. It's the polar opposite of shirk. And here Hallaj is saying, according to them, that he's not even speaking himself. The I there is God. So God is the I speaking through him, not that he himself is God. Now, you may or may not agree with this sort of verbiage. I definitely find it uncomfortable, but we're trying to read this kind of charitably to understand their viewpoint. So another Sufi mystic said, he kind of pointed to somebody who was grabbing their beard and said, take your hand off of God's beard. And they would, now this again seems very blasphemous. This is one of those kind of ecstatic sayings. But they kind of ground this idea in this religious idea that, and I believe this might even be a hadith, whether it's authenticity, I'm not sure of, but it's basically the saying that God has servants who hear by God, see by God, go by God, and come by God, eat by God, and are clothed by God. And this specific mystic was actually put on trial. And when he explained himself, that this is how he sees the world, that everything is God, the judge supposedly, and whether this is a real story or not, but the judge responds, if he exonerates the mystic and says, quote, if these people are heretics, then there is not a single monotheist on earth. So if maybe we feel this is kind of shirky, they're kind of inverting that and saying, no, this is actually the exact opposite, because all you're seeing is God. So Junaid was a very famous Sufi mystic in the 3rd century. He's probably the one who actually maybe put that term fana, which is annihilation of the self. And you basically, your ego and yourself is kind of annihilated, and then you're able to subsist or persist in God. And he linked this to a hadith Qudsi. Now, hadith Qudsi is a divine saying. It's a hadith that's attributed to the prophets, but it's in the voice of God. So supposedly in this, God says, when I love my servant, I become his ear with which he hears, his eye with which he sees, his hand with which he grasps, and his foot with which he walks. So that's the hadith I was talking about, that they kind of ground their idea in. So once you reach this 4th stage, you become part of the spiritual elect. So Sufis, they kind of divide the world into the masses, the awam, that's us, by the way, and then the spiritual elect, the al-khawas or the khas. Now, this idea of this elitism is actually very common in the pre-modern world. We'll see how the philosophers also differentiated between the masses and the spiritual and the philosophical elect or the intellectual elect. And in reality, we kind of do this ourselves. You, by being in this class, I'm going to say that you're part of the intellectually elect, right? This class probably doesn't make much sense to just an average person. You are part of this educated class. So it is a pre-modern idea, but it's not completely averse to everything we know in the modern era. So these Sufis, as spiritual elects, began to assemble, or spiritual elites, sorry, they began to assemble in their own elite prayer circles, and from there in their own lodges or khankas. They adopted their own initiation practices, such as the hand clasp and bayah, or they would take oaths of allegiances to their Sufi sheikhs, and they would have their own clothing. So they would wear the wool cloak. I'm sorry, I'm misspeaking a lot today just because I am tired since I worked the overnight shift, so I apologize. And I'm always surprised when I watch past video how much you can misspeak. I have to give Trump some leeway now that I have talked for so long. I notice how much I can misspeak. So, all right, once you become this spiritual elite, you can actually become a saint. Now, a saint is an English word. It's a Catholic word. Some Sufis may oppose it. Most Sufis accept it. Most Western scholars use it. There is a difference in the sense that Catholic saints are actually appointed by the church. That's not the case with Sufis. The Arabic term is actually wali, which is friend of God, but really it occupies this kind of saintly status. And they ground this idea in the Quran. They say they ground it in this verse 1062, truly the friends or the awliya, that's the plural of wali, of God. And so they kind of ground it in that. Here's a scholar, Karl Ernst. He wrote an introduction to Sufism. He writes, early Sufi writers insisted that sainthood, walaya, was the essential principle of Sufism. And we will see that this is a kind of a recurring theme in Sufism, this idea of a sheikh or a Sufi saint. This is essential to Sufism. And this is probably where my critique will come in. This is kind of an idea that I can't really buy in, but it is kind of essential to Sufism. Al-Qushayri was a very famous early Sufi mystic, one of the greats, and he defined a wali as one of the pious for whom God himself takes responsibility. And there is this idea that just as the prophet is immaculate, or he has isma, or infallibility, so the saint is also protected from sin. So we're going to see this idea that for the Sufis, they are the inheritors of the prophet's legacy, the spiritual legacy. Not only that, but the Sufi saints receive divine inspiration or ilham. So ilham is, and this is one definition from a Sufi site, that ilham is divine inspiration or effusion. It's effusion in the sense that it is emitted from the divine essence. So it has this kind of downflowing effect. Ilham is a blowing of the Holy Spirit into the heart of a prophet or a friend of God. The divine ilham is the immense spiritual force through which the friends of Allah speak their words of wisdom, write their books of knowledge, sing their songs of divine love. The verified sheikh can recognize the one into whom it is blown, and the word of God descends firstly as revelation, wahi, that's prophethood, and then secondly as inspiration, ilham. So there's kind of this continuity. There is a difference between the wahi that the prophet receives, that has ended according to Sufis, but the ilham in this way continues with the Sufi sheikhs after the prophet's death. According to one early Sufi, and this is different than the Tirmidhi that you probably know, or I knew from the Hadith collector. This is a different one, but he said that basically he argued, and this is kind of a recurrent theme, that the Sufis are ranked right below the prophets. And there's this, again, continuity. As soon as the prophethood ends, sainthood begins. And this is interesting because, as we'll see next week, next class, when we talk about Shi'i Islam and their imamate, a lot of Sunnis kind of say, oh, this is completely blasphemous how they have their imams after prophethood. But really, we see this concept in Sunni Islam as well, that there is this extension of prophethood, or this continuation in a slightly lesser form, but almost at the same level as prophethood. All right, and I'm going to answer questions shortly, but I just wanted to continue with a couple more slides. So we see that not only did Sufis, sheikhs, their saints, receive divine inspiration from God, they also were able to work wonders, or karamat. Really, karamat means miracles, but we kind of translate it as wonders to differentiate it between the miracles of the prophets. So just like the prophets, the saints are said to perform miracles. Though there are some differences, technical differences between the mu'jizat, or the miracles of the prophets, really, practically, they're almost the same. Because Sufi saints, they can predict the future. They can travel with great speed. They can walk on water. So really, they can do all the same kind of miracles. The only difference, and this is eventually what Sunni legal doctrine will say, is that the only real difference between them is that the prophetic miracle will come with a claim of prophethood, whereas the saint will not do that. And the other thing is that one cannot confirm or disconfirm a Sufi miracle, which is different than a prophetic miracle. But this was kind of the difference. But Sufi saints, their sheikh, shuyukh, they can do miracles. Now, I did want to, and in this lecture, I'm trying to do some more audiovisual material. So we're going to look at Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, who is a very respectable and reputable Sufi inclined sheikh in the West. I've benefited from his knowledge a lot. We're going to quickly listen to what he says about Sufi miracles or karamat.
The karamat al-awliya are in order for you to understand the mu'jizat of the prophets, because the mu'jizat, you see them, but you heard about them, but you didn't see them.
Okay, so I'm being told that I need to slow down. So I'm used to listening to things on YouTube, and this is where you do it, by the way, right here. I speed up everything to two times speed. But if I could go to 3 times, I probably would.
But when you see the karamat of the awliya, when you see the saints with their miracles, then it helps you understand that. And alhamdulillah, bifadlillah, there are people here, I'm sure, but bifadlillah, I've seen these people that I've seen it with my own eyes, wallahi. Some of the scholars that I studied with, clear. I mean, I'll just give you one example of this. Murabt Ahmed Fad, who's one of the most righteous people I ever met, sanctified person. You sit in his company, you'll know that he's sanctified. We were, and Ibrahim Osiafa, who knows Ibrahim Osiafa? You can ask him because he was there. Abdurrahman from Liverpool, I don't know his last.
So, and then Sheikh Hamza will talk about how he himself witnessed this Sufi miracle where he visited this Sufi sheikh, and the Sufi sheikh held up the tent that they were in the desert, and he held it up the whole night. And that was the miracle that, or the karama that Sheikh Hamza Yusuf witnessed. So that's Sheikh Hamza. Now there is this, in addition to, so that you have divine inspiration, you have miracles, you also have this concept of intercession, or being an intermediary between the believer and God. And the Sufi Sheikh does take that role. And so there's this idea of shafa or istighatha, which is basically praying to or through the saints, depending on who you ask. And this can be saints who are living or dead. And you seek barakah or blessings from or through the saints. That is, the saints, they basically get the blessings from God, and then the blessings emanate through them. And that's why you see in this picture, there's a Sufi Sheikh, and they're kissing his hand, and the barakah or the blessing is traveling from the hand to the murid, which is the disciple of the Sheikh. And because of this, Sufis will engage in ziyarah or religious pilgrimages to Sufi shrines or dargahs, because they're trying to seek that barakah, and they're also trying to seek intercessory help from these Sufi sheikhs. So some famous examples are Abdul Qadir Jilani and the Chisti, Khwaja Chisti. These are famous mausoleums in South Asia. And I did want to show another quick video. This is a video done by my colleague and friend, Professor Khalil Andani. He is a Shi'i Ismaili, but we'll see that there is this kind of connection with Sufism. And he has a video on intercessory prayer, basically shafa, where it's very sympathetic towards it. I do encourage you to watch it. That's to give you a sympathetic view of this intermediation. I myself have a kind of less positive view of intercession, as you saw in lecture 1. But I do want you to get this kind of diverse viewpoint and make your own decision. So I'm going to play this video just shortly.
We cannot dismiss this as a sort of fringe development. Now, when we turn to the Muslim world, we find the same thing. So here is pictures of people at the shrine of Idris the First. Idris is a Moroccan Sufi saint. So his shrine is in Morocco, and it is a popular spot of pilgrimage. And what you can see here is Muslims, these are Moroccan Muslims as well as others, they've come to the shrine of Idris, and they are seeking the blessings of this saint. They are touching his tomb, they're kissing his tomb, they're reciting prayers. And it's been said, if you ask the people in Morocco, they often say that those, many people cannot afford to go to Mecca for pilgrimage, but they can afford to go to the shrine of Idris the First. So many people come here instead of going to Mecca. Now, it's not only shrines, but you also have living Muslim saints or spiritual guides, spiritual leaders known as sheikhs. Here is a famous Sufi spiritual leader named Muhammad Abdullah Khan. He's the leader of the Naqshbandi Tariqa in the United Kingdom, so a branch of the Naqshbandi Tariqa in the United Kingdom. What you're seeing here is his disciples sort of paying homage to him, kissing his hand. In the other picture here, they are actually sort of they're touching him, as you can see, to get blessing. They actually believe that by even physical closeness to this person, they're accessing God's blessings. Here is another example. This is another Sufi spiritual leader or sheikh. Again, these are all Muslims. This is Sheikh Mehmet Effendi. He's the leader of another branch of the Naqshbandi Sufi Tariqa called the Naqshbandi Khalidi Tariqa. And here he's in a gathering of his disciples. He's placed his hand on the head of one of his disciples, as you can see here, who's in a state of prayer. And this is how the sheikh is blessing his disciple. And again, people have come to this Muslim spiritual leader to obtain God's blessings. Here in this picture, we have the leader of another Naqshbandi Sufi.
So it goes on, and he gives certain, some here's some more pictures, and here's the Shi'i Ismaili Imam. Basically, they're seeking the blessings and they're seeking God, intercession with God, and so that's a good video for you to watch on your own time. And you should also subscribe to Professor Andani's YouTube. He puts out a lot of great stuff. All right, so you have this idea of intercession. clearly now we're seeing, so we have the concept that they get divine inspiration, they have karamat or miracles, and they can intercede between the believer and God. So we see that for these Sufis, and we still remember the caliphs, they claimed to be heirs to the prophets. The religious ulama, they claimed to be the heirs to the prophet. But the Sufi sheikhs are also claiming to be heirs to the prophets. So we have this early Sufi mystic saying that they are the heirs, and that the end of the prophets is then the beginning of the saints. So just like Shias will claim that the end of the prophets is the beginning of the imams, similarly, Sunni Sufis are saying this about their saints or their shuyukh. Now, based on that, Sufism is characterized by a spiritual hierarchy. This is a busy slide, I apologize, but basically they see the world as, just like the political world has a hierarchy, right? There's a president or a king, and then his vizier, and then the lieutenants, and just like that, that's the political ordering of the world, but there's actually a spiritual hierarchy, which is the real hierarchy of the world. And so they have this idea of, there's this Ghaut, which is on the top. He's kind of the savior, and that's the one pictured there. And then below, there are all these different levels that they have, like these qutubs, these poles of the religion that are basically holding up this spiritual hierarchy. So it's hard to keep all this. So let's look at that website. So this is a live website. You see that they're showing this hierarchy. So this is the Ghaut, and under him are the 5 poles. And let's read who this Ghaut is. He takes, this is a key point, he takes from the heart of the prophet directly, right? He is the unique one to whom Allah gave the power of keeping all of the awliya, or the saints, together. Everything goes back from him to Prophet Muhammad. So again, we're seeing that same idea of being an heir to the prophets. And there's this idea that they're getting directly from God through the angels, actually. So, and you can see the different hierarchy here. So let's get back to our PowerPoint. So you have this sheikh-disciple relationship. This is called suhbah. Technically, it translates to companionship, but really it's discipleship. The term applies most specifically to the spiritual relationship which exists between the murshid and his murid, that is the sheikh and his disciple. The basis of such companionship is mystical conversation and communion. And I got this from that website, by the way. You, the murid, need a spiritual mentor, a sheikh or a murshid. You need this for spiritual salvation. Your salvation depends upon it. And you should be like a corpse in the hands of a mortician. This is a very recurrent idea in Sufism, this metaphor or analogy, however you want to call it, that you should be like a corpse in the hands of a mortician. You should be an empty glass. If you're not an empty glass, you won't be filled with this spiritual knowledge. And we're going to quickly look at another video in which we're going to see this adab, or this how the murid should treat his sheikh. Okay, I got to slow down again. I apologize. Prime these all for you guys. Okay.
First, to agree with his sheikh, whatever he says. Amran or nahyan. Order or preventing him from saying something, doing something, and ordering him to do something.
I encourage that behavior for this class, by the way, so just listen to whatever I say, okay?
Like a patient to a doctor.
I hate this analogy, by the way. Everyone uses it. I am a physician, and I did a fellowship in medical ethics. For God's sake, we are not teaching this anymore. Like we do informed consent, and we are encouraging people to help with their decision-making process, and to shop around and make an informed decision. So please, whatever your view, stop bringing us physicians into it, please.
The doctor will say to the patient, you do this, he follows. And submit and surrender. So this is one of the relationship of the external discipline that the murid has to show to the sheikh. conversation of his sheikh with complete adab. He must not lean on something, on a cushion or a pillow. And he must not yawn.
So I want you also to notice how many of these rules are similar to the rules of prayer. So you'll see the correlation.
Yawn in the presence of the sheikh. He must not yawn even when he is in the prayers. But unfortunately, we do that, so we have to struggle to stop it. And not to sleep. If you want to sleep, go and sleep home. Don't come. Because when you sleep and the sheikh is speaking, you bring the level of the sahaba down. Because there is someone sleeping and someone worse than that who is snoring. And too many of that. As soon as they sit for the sahaba of the sheikh, the advice of the sheikh, nasiha, they sleep. SubhanAllah, look, shaitan, how he plays with us. There is no sahaba, no sleeping. There is sahaba, there is sleeping.
He's really angry at some students for sleeping.
And must not laugh for no reason.
Oh, sorry.
Or smile for no reason. Because the sheikh is looking. Why he is laughing? I'm not laughing. I'm not giving permission to laugh in the time of the sahaba. Unless if he says something that makes people to laugh, it's his, from him it's coming. But from us, to laugh or to smile or to talk, like before we prayed Fajr, there were some talking here and smiling and laughing. I was hearing them. He must not raise his voice on his sheikh, especially in zikr. You find some people without permission of the sheikh. With permission of the sheikh, he tells some people to raise their voices. But without permission, you must allow the sheikh's voice to be heard, not your voice. ولا يتكلم. He must not talk completely, because this is a disrespect for the sheikh who is giving an advice, because he is sitting in not presence, but when alim said to speak, means it is the majlis of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Is a normal scholar, like you are on the member, it's member Rasulullah, and the mihrab is mihrab Rasulullah. So you cannot do anything that is not acceptable. Sahaba, they never spoke when Prophet is speaking. So ulama al-ummah, the scholar of the ummah or awliya of the ummah, they are inheritors of Prophet. So when they sit, that sitting has become important for akhir. So you don't need to smile or laugh or talk. Because this is disrespect to the sheikh. You can see some people talking and some people sleeping. That is disrespect. ومن صاحب المشايخ بغير أدب واحترام حرم مددهم. Anyone who follow, or those who follow the shuyukh without respect, because too much familiarity that they develop between.
So I encourage you to watch a little bit more of that on your own time. But he even says, for example, that even scratching yourself like this is not allowed when you're talking to the sheikh. And the reason is just like prayer, when you have you're not, there's certain people who say that if you move in prayer in the wrong way, your prayer breaks. Similarly, this is the incorrect adab when you're with your Sufi sheikh. So they see themselves as the heirs to the prophets. So we talked about this. You should be like the corpse in the hands of a mortician. Now, how did well, you know what? Let's take a pause here. I'm going to answer some questions now. So, all right. Before we go on, let's do some questions. So the first question from Ihtisham: what were the fundamental reasons for the creation or birth of Sufism? So this is a difficult question. I can't say. Like I said, this would be a question about origins, and I would say that probably similar and this links to a future question, which is by Salman, another question by Salman, that spiritualism is found in all major religions. Is it correct to say that when spiritualism met Islam, it became Sufism? I would say, I would less use this language of meeting, but I would say that perhaps this is kind of endemic in the milieu, so to speak. I know I'm not answering that question very well, but I try to stay away from foreign origins theories, because that's very hard as an intellectual historian to say that something comes from a certain source. All right, so let's see. So Sister Shua asked, why is Rumi not mentioned in your exposition of Sufi tradition? We're gonna get tons of Rumi in this presentation, I promise you. So please stay tuned for that. And a YouTube question. And again, YouTube and Facebook, you can ask questions too. So welcome to our YouTube and Facebook audiences. How is this intercession different from the intercession of the idols by Quraysh of Makkah? So this is a great question. I mean, I think I would be very much on board, on the same page as the person who asked this question. However, I would recognize a deep difference of opinion amongst Muslims on this issue. So actually, Professor Andani and I get into debates on this issue, friendly debates, I assure you. But the difference that they would claim is that these are intercessors who are validated by God, whereas the idols are not validated by God. So that is the significant difference that they make. Whether or not you think that's enough of a difference, that's up to you to make that decision. And then one last question. Or two more questions. Are these parallels to these miracles? Are there parallels to these miracles in other religions? I'm sure there are. I do think so. So there are parallels with this mysticism. And then from Nuha, it seems that the rules and practices listed are very strict and specific. Has these prevented the ideology of Sufism from spreading and or changing with modern times? We're going to get into that, and we'll see that Sufism is actually wildly successful, but we'll see that actually it probably helped with their spread. And then Hassan Osmani asks, will you address symbols of Sufism? I will a little bit, but maybe that's something that we can circle back to, and maybe Mr. Osmani can actually share with us a little bit on that. How would we know someone is an intercessor? This is a good question. There's no church that actually appoints people as saints. So it really is the respect of the community. And they have lineages that they go back. So you can't just claim yourself to be a Sufi sheikh. You really have to have that lineage. So we do have a verbal question. So let's have Uzma, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Javad, I have actually two questions. One is if you would be so kind to go back to the slide which had Ilham on it.
Mm-hmm.
And as I read through it and sort of was reflecting, so Ilham is a blowing in of the Holy Spirit into the heart of the Prophet, a friend of Allah. And then there was another one. Word of Allah descends first as revelation, wahi, and secondly as inspiration, ilham. So would you say that the Qadiani order is a strand of Sufism? Because they do believe that, you know, there was a wahi that was revealed to him. So just clarification on that. And then second question is, all the different Sufi orders, Hajwari, Chishti, Naqshbandi, what role did they play in the spread of Islam in the subcontinent?
So two great questions, and those tee me up actually to future slides. So as far as the first question, actually when I first was creating these lectures, I have those slides. They're going to come in the future on Ahmadis. Ahmadis are known by people as Qadianis. They call themselves Ahmadis. We're going to talk about this group. They're a modern group for those who are not familiar with them. But my actual point in all of this is to show that the Ahmadi ideas are actually not that crazy out there compared to other sects and groups that have existed in Islamic history. And actually, this is a point that Mr. Ghamidi has made repeatedly, that, and I'm going to share that video of Ghamidi Saab's at that point in time, that so I'm actually going to show. So I don't think that they are a sect. I do think there could be Sufi influence, and there definitely is Sufi influence. And he was even probably considered a Sufi sheikh. And they do consider him a Sufi sheikh, their founder. But I would say it's a little bit even deeper than that. It's that these ideas are kind of pandemic, to use a term nowadays. So that's what I would say on that. Whether or not we agree with that is a different story, and we'll get into critique later on. But that's to answer the first question. As far as the second question is concerned, we're gonna dedicate part of this lecture to the spread of Sufi Islam on the subcontinent. So thank you for that. All right, so let's move on now. We'll need to go a few more slides before we can take a break. So you might have a question. Where are these Sufis getting these ideas about, like, there are these different poles, Qutub and the Ghaut, and where do they get all of these ideas from? They're not in the Quran, so as we see it. Well, they had the idea of inner or esoteric meanings. The Arabic term is batin. So there's the zahir of something, which is the apparent or the external or the literal meaning of something. But then there's the batin, or the inner or deeper meaning of something. So they believe that the Quran and all, like, scripture has this outer meaning, and then there's also this deeper inner meaning. And so they're able to get this inner meaning or this batin knowledge. There is influence here from the Shia Ismaili groups. They were actually pejoratively known as the Batinis because they stress this inner meaning of things. And as well as the Brethren of Purity. There's some debate about who this Brethren of Purity were. They were an early kind of secret society, whether they were Ismaili or Sufi scholars debates, but there were these ideas of that you simpletons know the external, the awam, they only know the external knowledge, whereas the initiated have this inner, deeper knowledge. And so even the ulama that are just jurists, they would be kind of excluded from this elite class who know this inner knowledge. So Sufis would actually see themselves as higher than the people of hadith, the traditionists, and the fuqaha, the Islamic jurists, because they understand the exoteric, that is the external, as well as the deeper or esoteric meanings. Additionally, we have this idea, so we're going to see this idea of religious pluralism or inclusivism in Sufi thought. It's kind of there, that there's that inner core of this idea that, and you see it in this diagram, that all religions, their scriptures externally, on the external surface, they differ, but really their inner meanings, they're all pointing to that same inner, deeper reality, which is the God or divine presence. I do find this kind of to be a beautiful idea and concept, and we'll kind of circle back on this. Now, these inner meanings, how do you get to know them? Well, the only way you get to know them is through kashf, or mystical unveiling. This is knowledge not of the mind, but of the heart. This is an emanation from the divine essence to the human being, the Sufi sheikh. And they base it on this hadith of the veils, that between God and creation are these 70,000 veils, and the word is actually hijabs. And the Sufi sheikh, when things are unveiling, those veils are being unveiled, and then they see reality as it really is. It is related to mukashafa, which is disclosure. Again, it's divine irradiation from the divine essence. Now, there is this concept associated with this of antinomianism. That's a huge, big word, but basically it just means that you don't need to follow the law. You no longer need to follow the Sharia, because you know the deeper inner meanings of Islam, of God. So you no longer need to follow the external apparent law, because that's only for the masses or the simpletons. So, but this is only a belief held by some Sufis, okay? So some Sufis believe that the esoteric inner hidden meanings exempted them from following the less important or superficial outward meanings. So here we have one early Sufi mystic who is of this viewpoint. Now, other Sufis would accuse these Sufis of excessive permissiveness. They would criticize them for claiming that they were above Islamic law. Some of these antinomian Sufis would claim to have a divine or semi-divine status, and they were accused of sexual libertinism, outlandish behavior. And we have these terms that many of you may know of, kalandar, or malang, I believe, is another one. These are kind of people who straddle the society of what's considered acceptable behavior. And you see this image of this Sufi mystic here. He's kind of on this, the edges or the margins of society of what is considered acceptable or not. Remember that early picture we showed of the Sufi with the kind of eyeball popping out? This would not be the kind of quote unquote mainstream Sufi, and that's a debatable term, what's mainstream and what's not, but that would kind of be this antinomian side of Sufism, which definitely exists. Now, one really nice plus side of this antinomian Sufism was that they were they were often pluralistic in outlook. Again, because they thought that all of these religions are pointing to the same inner, deeper meanings. So there was this idea of being God intoxicated. And here you see that there's this difference between drunk Sufism and sober Sufism. That's how we call it. So on the left-hand side, you have Snoop Dogg Sufi, who is kind of the drunk Sufi. And then on the right-hand side, not as fun, I would say, not as fun looking, you have a sober Sufi. So the drunk Sufis would be kind of, they would even take God intoxication as a literal thing, and they often did drink wine, and we know that in Sufi shrines they even do drugs and that kind of thing. But this is the drunk Sufism, not the more sober, law-abiding Sufism. So the sober Sufis, they would stress the importance to follow Islamic law. Drunk Sufis would say we're beyond the law. Sober Sufis would say the first step is to follow the law. Only after that can you reach spiritual ecstasy. So you see that the Sufi on the Sheikh on the right is actually, he has a beard. I still haven't gotten my beard photoshopped in. I thought the Ghamidi Center team would do that for me. But you see that he is following this, this kind of the rigid basis of the law very closely. Now there is this idea that's in Sufism that there's this famous quote: Sufism is a name without a reality, but it used to be a reality without a name. Now, you'll often hear Sufis say this. So you'll see the sober Sufis saying this to the drunk Sufis, but there's this, or to the Sufis who are kind of more arrogant and showing off. There's always this idea that Sufism used to be, had its good old days. But in reality, this quote goes back like almost 1,000 years. And we see this kind of thinking all the way back in the 2nd century Hijri. So it's actually an early idea. And the reason I put this funny quote up here is that basically every generation of history has complained about the past generation. It goes back to the ancient Greeks. A lot of the things that people complain about millennials today, actually you see some of the ancient Greeks complaining about their current generation. There was also this idea amongst Sufis, there's this Arabic term that actually just means wannabe Sufi. So there's this idea that there's real Sufis and then there's fake Sufis. So the question we can ask ourselves, are Sufis marginal or are they mainstream to Islam? This is kind of a theme I'm going to keep coming back to. This scholar, Professor Kara Mustafa, argues that, and I agree with him, that judging by the historical record that we have, Sufis were actually affiliated with the traditionalists, that is the Ahl Hadith, and the Asharis. These are the two main groups of Sunni Islam. We're going to get into the Asharis in a future lecture. So if you don't know what that term means, don't worry. But it's basically what was considered quote unquote mainstream even to this day. Now, why is that? Why would Sufis be considered, why would they get along with the traditionists? These are the group that we saw last week. They were kind of they were really about text and following law. You wouldn't think so, right? You'd think the Sufis would be completely opposed to them. But the reason is that both groups kind of share a dim view of human reason. Sufis did not think that your mind could reach eternal, ultimate truths, but rather God has to give those to you. And the Asharis, we'll see, the other mainstream group that claims to be the orthodoxy, also have this view that human reason cannot reach these ultimate truths of what's right and wrong. This conflicts with the Mu'tazilis, which is another future group we're going to look at, which are the Islamic rationalists. And actually, I say future group only because we're going to discuss it in a future lecture. But really, the Mu'tazilis are the earliest Islamic theological group in existence. But they were Islamic rationalists. They placed a value on human reason, and they were therefore very critical of the Sufis. And we'll see that even though the Mu'tazilis died out, we'll see some modern Islamic intellectuals who kind of share this kind of critical view of Sufis, and we'll see that. So coming to now the turn of the millennium, we see that Imam Ghazali, I'm sure you've heard of Imam Ghazali. He is kind of like the most mainstream Sunni scholar. He has a death date that's very easy to remember, 1111. He is a candidate, I would argue, for the greatest scholar of Sunni Islam. He was a jurist, a theologian. He was even a philosopher. I know he's credited as being the one who killed philosophy, but from our Western academic standpoint, he was actually a great philosopher. And but most importantly, he was also a Sufi mystic. Ghazali, by the time of Ghazali, Sufism is kind of firmly entrenched in Sunni Islam. And he will kind of put the cherry on top because he writes his biography and says that I, Ghazali, basically first I studied Islamic law and I didn't find, I found that was good, but it was not good enough. Then I studied Kalam, or I was a theologian. The word is slipping my mind, but theology, that's the word, sorry. So he studied theology and he said that was good too, but that wasn't good enough. Then he studied philosophy. He didn't like philosophy at all, but we're gonna talk about this in a future lecture. And then he said, he finally came to the last group, which is the Sufis. And then he said, you know what? They actually are the ones who are able to attain the highest truth. And they are the ones who are kind of the most guided. And he came to this view after he had a spiritual crisis. There's this famous event in his life story in which he says that he became mute and he couldn't even talk. And the only way that he regained his senses is by reaching this mystical experience where God kind of affirmed belief in ultimate truths. One idea that Imam Ghazali has that I really like, and I'm not sure if he's the originator, I don't think he is, of this idea, but he kind of popularized it, is this idea of dhawq, which is tasting. It's the Arabic term for tasting. It's kind of a beautiful idea. And as an intellect, as someone who studies in the Western Academy, it kind of hit my heart a lot when he says this. But he basically says, you can study wine all day, but have you actually tasted it? That's a very profound idea, that until you actually taste something, you haven't really experienced it. And that's what he's talking about when it comes to knowing God. You may be a theologian and talk all about God. I'm I'm a budding Islamic intellectual historian. I have all these random facts in my brain that I'm telling you, but have I really experienced God? That's a different story. So he says, even if you've studied for 100 years and collected 1,000 books, so even all these books behind me, knowledge alone will not be your salvation. And so he basically says the Sufis are the ones who get it most right. And in his massive book, which is the Ihya, or the Revival of the Religious Sciences, this is a multi-volume book, amazing book. He has some very great ideas in here. I was definitely touched by many things that he wrote in this. For example, he talks about people, he criticizes the Islamic jurists. That's kind of the group we studied in the last lecture. He says, you guys are so worried about whether your wudu is broken or not, or what's pure and what's impure, but really you should focus on prayer as something that you're connecting to the divine. And so he has this idea, it's quite attractive. And so I do encourage you to see that book, and we'll cite it at the end of this course, of this lecture. So after Ghazali comes this, so Ghazali is said to have killed Islamic philosophy. That's not, Western scholars have kind of debunked this. But really what happens after this is that philosophy merges with Sufism. And then you have this school of thought that comes, the Ishraqi school, the Illuminationist school. And Suhrawardi is the one who's most famous for it. I know I'm throwing a lot of names at you, but I do want to give you a comprehensive view of Sufism. So you have this melding of Sufi mystical thought with philosophy, and that's called theosophy. That's the Western term for it. But the basic idea is that God is this light of lights, and he emanates this light from him. And that's how basically all existence on earth are created. So what the idea is that God is the ultimate reality, and everything else is just kind of a shadow of that reality. And Mullah Sadra is a Sufi and a Shia scholar who will take this illuminationist school and become its most famous advocate. I'm sure you've heard of Ibn al-Arabi. He also has his own theology and philosophy and Sufism that he kind of mixes together. He's known as Sheikh al-Akbar. He's most famous for this theory of Wahdat al-Wujud, which is the unity of existence. Basically, it's the idea that since God is the only real existing thing and everything else bases its existence upon God, really there's only God in this world. Now, I put the question mark, is this monism or pantheism? That is a question that you have to answer, whether you think that is or not. Now, there is this scholar from India, Sheikh Ahmed al-Sirhindi in the 17th century, who will criticize Wahdat al-Wujud. He himself is a Sufi. He will say that, no, we should believe in Wahdat al-Shuhud, or the unity of experience. But from my standpoint, they're not too terribly different. They almost, and I'm not the only one who says this, they almost seem like a semantic difference, nothing more. But you may disagree with me. And Ibn al-Arabi is also known for his idea of the perfect human, and Prophet Muhammad or Adam are considered that perfect human who exemplify the morality of God. So we're almost ready to take a break, but there was that question about how Sufism spread. So we see that Sufism spread all over the Islamic world. These are the different major tariqas and their spread. So we see the Naqshbandis, for example, and the Chistis, they spread to India. The Shadli Sufi order spreads to West Africa. So this is kind of the spread. It spreads all over the Islamic world. So we see this map of the different Islamic groups and sects. I didn't make this map, schema. Hold on. So that kind of disappeared. I'll put this here. Okay. So we see that these are the legal schools we studied. So there's Islam here, and then it's broken down into Sunni and Shia Islam. Here's this 4 Sunni legal schools. And then you have these Sufi orders. The reason they put it outside here is not because they're completely separate from this, but it's because you could be a Maliki and you could belong to a Shadli Sufi order, or you could belong to a Naqshbandi one. But these are kind of the main Sufi tariqas that kind of spread throughout the Islamic world. All right, and we'll come back to this schema later. Now here I do want to tell you about the Persianate world. Sufism spreads throughout what we call the Islamo-Persianate world, or as Shahab Ahmed, a professor, he called it the Bengal to Balkans complex. The reason why this is important is that for almost 1,000 years, the center of Islam was the Persianate world. It was not the Arab Middle East, but this Persianate world. And the Islam of this Persianate world is very different than the Islam that you and I kind of now think of. It was very different. There was this emphasis on literary humanism, poetry, music, dance, figural art. So we have this idea now in modern Islam that Islam is totally opposed to all pictorial representations. Yet art like you're seeing on this slide was actually very common at this time. Now I have no problem with any of these things. I actually like all of these things, but then in the red, there's certain things that, you know, I'm kind of uncomfortable with, and you might be, wine, homoeroticism. This was something that was very shocking to me. And by homoeroticism, I mean specifically pederasty, which is in Urdu, we call it bachabazi, which is love for young boys, basically boys who don't have their beards. This is a very common idea in the culture. Not just in the Persian Islamic culture, but in many pre-modern cultures, this was very common amongst the Greeks, for example. But it was very shocking to me reading this. But there was also harems, brothels, and slavery. So actually women had the double depredation of they were both completely in not just niqab, but in parda and zanana, that is that they were confined to a quarter of the house, but simultaneously they were over-sexualized as well. So they were the women in the brothels and slaves and in the harems. So you have this kind of dual kind of bad state that women were in at this time. Now, Sufism in this Islamic Persianate world, which, by the way, in my view, has positives and negatives. You know, I put the red where I kind of feel uncomfortable, but there was also the literary humanism, the poetry, music, dance, which I find very beautiful. And you may have your own view on what you like and what you dislike. But what's clear, though, is that Sufism was a central expression of Islamic piety, probably the central expression of Islamic piety in this Islamo-Persianate world for almost more than 1,000 years. This, by the way, is the Persianate world. It's not just Iran that we think is the Persianate world, because it's about languages. So it's a Persianate Turkish world. That's what we consider the Persian world. So here you have, you know, in the early pre-modern era, you have basically near the end of the pre-modern era, you have these three empires: the Ottoman Empire, Safavid Empire, and the Mughal Empire. All three are Persianate, considered part of the Persianate world. And in all three is Sufism extremely important. So in the Ottoman Empire, Sufi orders are connected with the ruling elite. The Safavid Empire was actually started by a Sufi order that eventually converts to 12er Shia Islam. And in India, Islam was spread mostly through Sufism. That's what Western scholars think. Now, keep in mind, it's not the idea that we have, and some Pakistani literature does portray it in this way, that Sufis were going out and trying to proselytize and preach and do dawah, as we call it. That's not how it happened. What happened was that Sufis had their shrines and their places of worship, and they had this idea of religious pluralism. So people of many different religions, Hindus, Sikhs, they would visit these shrines, and they would seek blessings from the Sufi sheikh. Even if you were a Hindu, you don't have to believe in Islam to believe in the power of the Sufi sheikh, especially if you saw a miracle yourself. So you would come to the Sufi sheikh. And it's through this process, this gradual process, that Islam spreads through much of the subcontinent. So in the Mughal Empire, emperors actually patronized Sufis, and they grounded their authority in them. So the emperors, who, by the way, were like semi-divine rulers, they thought that God had sent them down on earth, and they basically cemented their power by getting the barakah, or the blessings, from the Sufi sheikhs and from their shrines. So Sufism, in my view, is you know, and I'm not the only one. So there's Shahab Ahmed. This is a book, What is Islam? I strongly recommend you to read this book. But he argues that Sufism came to represent Islamic practice, which the majority of Muslims experienced in this Islamo-Persianate world. This will change in the modern period, but in this middle period of Islamic history, Sufism is quite central. Now that brings us to the modern period. In the modern period, Sufism will take a lot of hits. And that's why now Sufism is considered very, at least I grew up thinking of it as a very marginal part of Islamic, you know, of the Islamic society. But there are certain reasons for that. So the first is we have these revivalists or fundamentalist groups, and the quintessential one is the Wahhabis. They are very much opposed to Sufism. They accuse the Sufis of shirk. And they don't like any of this intercession business, the shrines seeking barakah from Sufi sheikhs. They not only disagree with it, but they actually they kill many Sufis in their shrines and Shias. You know, and this goes on even to today. You'll see that people who are inspired by this brand of Islam will actually bomb Sufi and Shia shrines and mosques. But it wasn't just the fundamentalists who were opposed to Sufis. The reformists or the modernists, and I have, by the way, no value judgment when I say this word modernist. Some people take that very negatively, but I don't mean it in that way whatsoever. I use it as an academic classification. But these reformists or modernists, they saw Sufism as superstitious and anti-modern. They were opposed to the fatalism that Sufis have, and fatalism. So most famously, Allama Iqbal, who's in the middle picture there. So that's Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab on the left. And then there's Allama Iqbal in the center, who many of you must know. He was a poet and scholar and intellectual from India. He disliked Sufism greatly, and mostly because of this fatalism, this idea of qadar, that basically, well, what's going to happen is what's going to happen. God decreed it, so that's all that matters. So I don't need to do anything. So he opposed this idea. And these reformists and modernists thought that Sufism is anti-modern, anti-scientific, and anti-intellectual, just like the Mu'tazilis of the past did. Now, the third kind of blow to Sufism was from the colonial powers. as well as the emerging nation states, the post-colonial states. These state powers saw the Sufi orders as rivals to their power. Keep in mind that Sufism was widespread, and these Sufi sheikhs had a lot of power because they controlled the masses. So these entities, these states, the nation state wanted to reduce their power. So actually, the person on the right is Ataturk. He founded the modern nation state of Turkey. He actually outlawed and banned Sufi orders, and that's to reduce their power. And you actually see, so Sufis are considered kind of like peaceful and tolerant, which they might be. That's up to you to decide. But in the 19th century, I would say that's kind of a reductionist viewpoint. You see in the 19th century that actually Sufis are waging jihad against the colonial state. So they weren't, this idea of them as completely pacifistic or peaceful, I think that's an oversimplification. Now, here's one modern or modernist thinker, Professor Fazlur Rahman. We've talked about him before. This is where my inspiration, my intellectual inspiration comes a lot from, but he was definitely opposed to, he had a problem with Sufism. But you see here that he recognized and he had to deal with the idea that Sufism for much of Islamic history was very much quote unquote mainstream. So Fazlur Rahman notes quite unhappily that the importance and depth of Sufism simply cannot be overestimated. So he admits that even though he himself was a critic of Sufism. This brings us to Mr. Javed Ahmed Ghamidi. For those of you who don't know, because not everybody is follower of the Mawrid Institute, he is the founder of the Mawrid Institute, and the Ghamidi Center is named after him. So he is definitely a critic of Sufism. He, in his view, Sufism is a parallel religion to Islam. And the reason why he's skeptical of Sufism is because he's skeptical towards claims grounded in esoteric and hidden knowledge, or this batini kind of mindset. He also, another part of his critique is that he is skeptical of these grandiose claims of Sufi saints, their claims of divine inspiration, miracles, and intercession. So that's really why, at least what I can identify, why Ghamidi Sahib is opposed to Sufism. This is from my reading of it, but you should definitely go directly to the source to get his viewpoint on this. And then there are also theological differences or philosophical differences. Ghamidi Sahib would definitely, I think, oppose Wahdat al-Wujud, and actually I've seen that he does oppose this doctrine because it seems very pantheistic. So that's Ghamidi Sahib's viewpoints, and I would definitely place him as one of the reformist intellectuals who's critical of Sufism. Now, on that note, I would place, so this is the last slide, and then we'll go to a break. I would place myself in the same line of thinking. I hope that even though I'm going to give a critique, by the way, this is what we call the last chapter syndrome. I'm going to give my own viewpoint. I'm taking off my academic hat now, and I'm putting on my religious hat, and I'm telling you what my personal viewpoint is. You don't have to agree with this. You can even shut off your video and walk away if you don't want it. But I also share this critique. Although I cannot bring myself to say Sufism is a parallel religion, on a substantive level, I share most, if not all, of Mr. Ghamdi's criticisms and have some further differences of opinion with Sufism, which I'm not sure if he shares or not. That's why I put that there. Including, I am skeptical of claims grounded in esoteric and hidden knowledge. I do not accept claims of divine inspiration, miracles, and intercession. In fact, I would say I am more Wahhabi than the Wahhabis when it comes to intercession. I don't kill people for doing it, and I don't call them kafir. That's a different story. But I don't even believe in intercession of the Prophet. I am disturbed by what I consider also to be Sufi magical thinking. But I realize that this is my own modern way of thinking. So you can criticize it, you can say I'm naive, but that's just my own viewpoint. Like Ghamidi Sahib, I also have my own theological and philosophical differences with Sufism. So I am a proponent of common sense realism, which was propounded most famously by Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid. This is the idea that what we see out there in the world, like my hands, these are real. Why? I can slap my face, I know it's real. This is very different than the theosophy that we saw, the Ishraqi philosophy, which is kind of the quintessential Sufi philosophy, that what we see in the world is not real reality. It's just a shadow of reality. that for me, I don't really, I think that it is reality, and I have to use induction to come to God. I look at the world around me, and then through a process of induction, I infer that God exists. That's just the philosophical view that I take. And then I also reject fatalism like Allama Iqbal. And then I also don't agree with divine command ethics we'll get into that in a future lecture. I also place a very high view on human reason, philosophy, and science. That's kind of why I wanted to teach this course, because I'm excited to teach about the Islamic rationalists and philosophers. And I also believe in this Protestant work ethic. That is, that we need to get up and go in the world, be productive, found startups, become multimillionaires so that we can then do works of righteousness. But I think that's important. Furthermore, I'm opposed to this spiritual or organizational hierarchies. I value egalitarianism. When I see a Sufi sheikh, I don't think he's any smarter, pious, or better than I or you. I think just because you have specialized knowledge does not mean that you are a pious individual, that you have taqwa. The example I give is, I think one of the people that in my life that I think has the most taqwa is my dad. I think he is a pious, righteous man. He's not a Sufi sheikh. He's not, I have more, technically I have more Islamic knowledge than him. I'm studying, I have a PhD, I'm getting a PhD in Islamic studies, but I'm nowhere near the kind of pious and great man that my father is. So I don't think you need to be, if you're a Sufi sheikh or you're an Islamic scholar, you have some specialized knowledge, but to me that doesn't speak anything about taqwa. That's my personal view. So when I see a big, dari, a big beard and a nice robe and all this, for me, I'm not surprised when it comes out that they molested a kid or they had an affair. For me, I'm not surprised. We're all human beings. That's part of the human condition. So I don't agree with the idea that human beings can be divided into these states or stations of faith. On my view, these states exist simultaneously within us and are part of the human condition. That is to say, you don't reach the state where, for example, a woman walking across the street, your eye is not, tempted to look. That's part of human condition, whether you're a sheikh, whether you're, Ghamidi Saab, whether you're me, whether you're the person next door, we all go through the same challenges. That's my view. Finally, and I also wrote here that I am not a corpse or an empty cup. I don't agree with this view of teaching. I think this is keeping us back as Muslim. I think it keeps Muslims back. I think, for example, I studied electrical engineering, computer science for 2 years, believe it or not. And in engineering and computer science, there's actually this view that the youngins, the younger people, the fresh graduates, or even the high school students, they're probably like, let's get their ideas. What are they saying? Like, they're probably like coming up with the hippest technology. So I actually think that, and I say this kind of tongue in cheek when I say it, I'm not a corpse or an empty cup. I'm a Ferrari. You as the scholar, the sheikh, you can fill me up with gas, you can tweak my engine, but really, I view the young people as the Ferraris, and our job is to give them fuel. But that's how I see it. Finally, the other thing is, and I'm a big proponent of this, my last point is, be normal. Dress normally, talk normally, act normally. Being Islamic doesn't mean you have to wear a huge robe and a huge dari and talk kind of strange and sermon tones all the time. And this is one of the reasons why, when I met Ghamidi Saab, I was most impressed. That he is this quote-unquote celebrity imam with millions of followers. But when I met him in his house, he was a normal human being. He talked to me like a normal human being. I met his son, who was not even studying, he's studying finance or software engineering. I forget exactly what it was, but he was so normal. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. So that's my view. But again, I realize that I'm definitely situated as a modern person. Now, with all of that critique, and yet, with all that said, and even though I cannot bring myself to call myself a Sufi, I still find certain elements of Sufism to be irresistible and think they should be incorporated into our modern expression of Islam. For example, Ghazali's writing on dhawq or tasting did hit my heart. Am I, as a Western academic, Am I just describing wine instead of drinking it? I find the emphasis on knowing God and being motivated for his sake alone to be appealing. As Aisha Bayuniya said, I really love this quote, or actually this is a paraphrase of her, but believers are to surrender themselves to God and willingly accept his loving grace. I find that concept beautiful. And finally, and most importantly, I am impressed by the Sufi Mazhab of love, religious pluralism, and Sufi poetry, music, and dance. And that, my friends, is what we're going to talk about in part 2. In part 2, we're going to talk about the Madhab of love. So even if I was critical and you're critical of everything in part 1, please reserve judgment. There's some stuff in part 2 that I hope you will enjoy, just like I do. And with that, we will take a break. We'll come back and let's make it a 7-minute break. All right, I'll see you in 7 minutes. Thank you so much. Okay, I realize many people are still on break. I'm going to be start answering some questions. This is being recorded, so hopefully you can go back. But we are a little bit short on time, so I'm starting a couple minutes early just to answer questions. We're still on break, though, don't worry. So the question is from Reshma. So would someone who is Kalandar or Malang actually be a Sufi sheikh, or would they be more an individually realized Sufi? I thought that a genuine Sufi sheikh was supposed to follow the Sharia. So what I would say is that, remember, there is this drunk Sufism and this sober Sufism. So if you were a sober Sufi, you would absolutely argue that being a true Sufi is to follow the letter of the law. But if you were a drunk Sufi, you may not have that viewpoint. So it would depend on who you ask. This is a great question. Muhammad asks, is Sufism a result of human beings' struggle with the concept of a transcendent deity, not being able materialistically to connect to that distant deity? Yes, I absolutely agree with you. I think that that is correct. I think it is actually human beings attempting to become to achieve a state of transcendence ourselves and to connect with God. So I do think if you look at some kind of rationalistic or philosophical theologies, God is very distant, not a reality. So in Sufism, God becomes this reality that you can relate to. So I think that's part of the human condition, where we're trying to get transcendence ourselves, and then also that is get outside of our mundane human existence and touch the divine, and then also how can we relate to God, basically. All right, Kamran asks, all Sufi orders link themselves back to Hazrat Ali and eventually to the Prophet. Their claim that Tasawwuf and its principles were derived from the Batin, does that claim of theirs stem in any way from any ayah from the Quran, or where do they place the basis for this? Okay, so again, I would say that there are sober and drunk readings of Sufism, and it depends on who you ask. I think the more drunk you are, the more you're going to ground your claims in this batin and experiential knowledge. I still think it's there in the sober Sufism, but they would kind of more minimize it. As far as the exact basis, I think they would ground it in many of the same verses that Sunni scholars would, where it says, ask the people of knowledge in the Quran. They're more vague kind of verses that they would use to claim authority. And we see that many different competing groups are using similar verses to claim authority. All right, so with that, we're gonna get started. I apologize for such a short break. So we're gonna get started. Part 2, the Mazhab of love. Now it's if it's Persian and Urdu, Mazhab-i-Ishq, or Madhab in Arabic. So I don't know about you, but I grew up with fire and brimstone Islam. Growing up, I had always associated Islam with God-fearingness, but never with love. God's love for us, or even our love for him, seemed too audacious a claim to make. I thought Christians did that only. I didn't think Muslims do that. I therefore internalized Western views of Islam as a religion of law, rules, and justice, compared to Christianity, which was a religion of love and mercy. And yet, I was so surprised, and this was quite recently, I must confess, when I started reading Sufi literature, which pushed me in the right direction to see verses in the Quran that they quote about love. God, we read in the Quran, God loves them, that is the believers, and they love God. God loves those who turn to him. God will love you and forgive you. God placed between you love and mercy. Is the audio good, by the way? Audio good? Yes, okay, good. So I was quite surprised when I saw the word love in the Quran everywhere. I had grown up thinking this was a Christian idea. And then we see that not only does God place love between you, that is the believers, but also there's love that God might create between you and your enemies. There's such verse. I see the kid waving. That's love right there. All right. This is a book that I strongly recommend you to buy. It's by Professor Ahmed Safi, a very sweet, great man that I admire. He has a book called Radical Love, in which he's done a great service, I think, by translating a bunch of Sufi poems or Sufi-inspired poems that are about love. We're going to be stealing from his book quite a lot here. He writes, for example, so this is, he writes, Professor Safi writes, the mystical path, one called Mazhab-e-Ishq, that's what they called it. Now keep in mind, Ishq and Mahabba. Mahabba is the Arabic word in the Quran, or Muwadda as well. That's love. Ishq is like a passionate or fiery love. And that's what Professor Safi is saying, that these Sufi mystics, they not only wanted Mahabba with God, but they also wanted Ishq with God, this passionate love. So these love mystics have talked about the path, the mazhab of radical love. That's how Professor Safi is translating Ishq, as radical love. They believe that this is God's own path. In this vision, this mazhab, the whole of humanity, all who have ever been and ever shall be, are gathered before God. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm kind of babbling here, but this is a story that is narrated about, it's a parable basically, how God gathers all of humanity before him, and he asks them, who here wishes to have all of your worldly desires? And 9 out of 10 people raise their hand, and so God says, okay, it's granted to you. Then the people who remain, God asks them, who wishes to be spared hellfire? And then again, 9 out of 10 people raise their hand, and God says, I grant it to you. And then those people leave. And then of the people remaining, God says, who of you wants the rewards of paradise? And again, 9 out of 10 people raise their hand. And so God says, I grant it to you. And then those people leave. And then a very small minority of people are left. And then God asks, why are you still here? I've already offered you everything. And so these people are said to say, this is at the very bottom, they lowered their heads in humility and said, you are why we are here. You yourself know who we desire. So they desire God. God as a friend, as an intimate, as the beloved. This is like shocking language to me. Growing up, I would never have thought this was Muslim or Islamic terminology. But these people, this Sufi poetry talks about God as an intimate, a beloved. There's also this cosmology of love. God creates the entire universe out of this love to be known and his love for humanity. And they base it on this hadith of God being this hidden treasure. Aisha Bayuniya, she has this book, very famous book, Principles of Sufism. Strongly urge you to buy this book. But basically the recurrent theme in it, the cement that, the glue that kind of cements everything together is love. And she defines love as the total effacement of yourself such that you are consumed in your beloved. Love necessitates forgiveness. Nothing remains of you. The signs of love are innumerable. Love is God's grace. This love forgives sins, covers faults, exalts the humble, raises the fallen. Such is God's love for his worshiper. So this is language that's, I mean, we're talking about the 16th century. This is a part of our Islamic tradition that I frankly was not familiar with. I had just heard the fire and brimstone, that you're going to dozak, you're going to hellfire for 70,000 years for missing a prayer. That's what's going to happen to you. And so this other tradition does exist. Now we're going to go through some poetry, different snippets. This is Ahmed Ghazali. He was the brother of the more famous Ghazali. He says, I will write you a book on ishq, radical love, provided you do not bifurcate it into divine love and human love. So there's not only love for God, but that's the same love that we have for human beings. So you see that duality here. And now what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to see if we can get some participation here. So let's see if I can get my chat for participants. Okay, I'm going to ask actually Sarah to take over, Sarah Baji to take over. And what we're going to do is I'm going to show a quote, and I want one person to volunteer to read a few quotes. So I stop talking so much. So the Sheikh, me, allows you, the Murids, to read. I won't blame you for this, don't worry. So does anybody want to volunteer? And I'll let my sister take over now.
Khurram, do you want to read one?
I'll read if you don't.
And you can read more than one. I'll keep advancing them, and then we'll stop after the end of the page.
Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Drink, he forgives. God's grace is bigger than my sin.
So I also want you to then give your commentary. When you read this, what are kind of the themes that you're seeing here?
I guess my understanding is that the poet is encouraging us to live a full life, to not be too, I guess, ascetic or live a life of denial.
That's interesting. I didn't even think of that. And I also, so that's great. I also think you see wine. We're going to talk about wine poetry. So the Sufis they use double entendres a lot, where a word means one thing, like even love for God. Sometimes they're talking about love for a beloved, but really they're also talking about love for God, and it's confusing. Who are they talking about? And sometimes they're talking about both simultaneously. Here we have Hafez, who's a very famous poet. Is he talking about wine? And actually, if you read the context, it actually is wine that he's talking about. But is he talking about the intoxication for God? So we see this wine poetry that, frankly, I don't know about you, but I was never familiar with. And then we see also this emphasis on forgiveness. God's grace is bigger than my sin, right? Go ahead, drink, no problem. So this is also a concept. So I'm going to advance, and then you keep reading, and then you tell me what you think. So I liked your commentary a lot.
From Tsunami, that
Yep.
My sin is great, but you are greater than my sin.
So yeah. So what do you see from that? Same kind of theme, right?
Yeah, that your shortcomings, I guess, don't define you. You know.
And God is forgiving, basically. So would you mind keep going?
From Rabia, oh my God, if tomorrow you send me to hell, I'll cry out, I loved you. Is this how you treat your friends? The voice of God responded, oh Rabia, don't think of me so poorly of me. I'll raise you among my friends so you and I can speak.
So do you see how, at least I feel that Sufi poetry straddles the line between what's acceptable and what's kind of almost on the borderline of blasphemous.
Right.
So I find that very interesting. Do you mind just reading a couple more?
Sure. A man not knowing said to God, oh God, at long last, open a door for me. Rabia was there. You fool, the door's never been closed.
And that's the theme you were talking about. So good, you teed that up.
Many paths to the Kaaba from Rumi. The paths are many, the destination is one. Do you not see there are many paths to the Kaaba?
What theme do you see here? I know I'm putting you on the spot.
No, pluralism. Right?
Exactly, I agree with you. All right, thank you so much. I appreciate you volunteering for that. So let's, I'm gonna go through a few of them and then we'll call on some more volunteers. So here again, we see that kind of semi-proper, semi-blasphemous kind of poetry here. But this is an interesting story where someone, but basically God says to this Sufi that, do you want me, that is God, to tell people everything I know about you so that they stone you? That is the blasphemous things that you say, that I, like, ana al-haq, I am the truth. Do you want me, God, to reveal that to people so they stone you as a blasphemer? And then the sheikh responds back and says, oh my God, do you want me to tell them everything I know about your loving mercy and forgiveness? Everything I see from your generosity? If I do, no one would ever bother with acts of worship. No one would prostrate to you in prayer. The voice of God responded, you say nothing, I say nothing.
Javed?
Yeah.
The chaplain has to leave promptly at the close of class. He had a question.
Yeah, please, chaplain, go ahead.
Oh, so it's some of it's a comment, but you know, I wonder kind of what you think about it. It seems to me that this whole phenomena of what we call Sufism seems to come and fill this sort of void that took place as a result of the political fitnas that were going on. Because to me, everything that's good about Sufism, I find quite glaringly clear in the Quran. And so you have that element, and then you also have the element of sort of the early Umayyad opposition and sort of alienation from Ali ibn Abi Talib, and sort of that making it sort of unpopular to be directly linked, because these Sufi tariqas who have these silsila that go back to Ali, these silsila were kept hidden for a long time, right? Because of the environment. So I have trouble kind of like with this, with sort of the notion of it seeing it as something separate. Of course, over time, many different things start to change, different environments and so on and so forth. But I don't see these things being void in the personality of the Prophet and his approach to Islam as a whole.
And I agree with you. I think Sufis would say that they would actually double agree with you. And they would say, absolutely, we're grounding ourselves in the Prophet and his character. So even though, so I see that you could take it in both ways. And I see a lot of what you're saying, and I appreciate the feedback and the insight. So thank you for that. And we will, I hope you stick around. I'm gonna just a couple more minutes, because so I'll go through some of these slides really quickly, because I did want to go into not just the poetry, but also the music, art, and the dance, basically. So you basically see here in all of these poems, this connection between the divine love and human love. And you see here the kind of the religious pluralism. Come wherever you are, infidel, fire worshiper, idol worshiper, come back to God, basically. And basically, if you can't attain to the love of the Creator, strive for the love of humanity. Dance in the light of God. Love of a human being is an ascension towards love of God, the All-Merciful. So you see a lot of this. This is Ibn al-Arabi. He basically, again, this pluralism. I follow the religion of love. Whichever way this caravan turns, I turn. This love is my religion. This is my faith. Rumi, lots of Rumi. Here's the wine intoxication that Rabia talks about. Again, the religious pluralism in Rumi. More Rumi. Oh, no, this is Iraqi, sorry. This is about just humans being good to each other. There's no longer me, no you, only in us. Everyone bows toward the sanctuary in Makkah. I bow down toward my beloved's face. So we see that they're talking about God as the beloved. This is a really great story. I put it up for my mother. But basically, there are two brothers, and one of them is very pious and does or pious in the traditional sense, and does a lot of ritualistic prayer. And the other one just services his mother. And then God says to the one who is so busy in the ritualistic prayer and says, don't worry, I have forgiven you for the sake of your brother. And he says, what? I'm the one who does all this religious prayer. And basically, then God replies that, oh, I forgave you because of the service that your brother did for your mother. So there's this idea of love and obedience to God is also doing service to humanity. Who loves the artist glorifies the art. That is, if you love God, you love God's creation. So there's, this one is kind of, I really like this one. This is kind of the kind of sacrilegious or like almost vulgar one, and it's by Rumi. A fly sat on a straw on a puddle of donkey piss, full of pride, lifted its head up. I am the captain of the ship, master of this ocean. That's actually very profound. But you see that they're kind of straddling this kind of acceptability and pushing the boundaries. So then there's this one where it says, talks about how God commanded us all to pray in the direction of the Kaaba. So there's all these people praying in a circle to the Kaaba. And then it says, okay, well, if you get rid of the Kaaba, what are we doing? We're all praying to each other. We're all prostrating to the divinity in each other. Love must be met by love. The only proper response to love is love. So there's a lot of this. I'm going to put these slides up. There's a hadith. And it's good to end with this hadith, I think, which is quite beautiful. Be merciful to those on earth, and the one in heaven will be merciful to you. So they are grounding these ideas in Quran and hadith. So it's not like these are extraneous to Islam. On this point, I wanted to talk about something that my advisor, Professor Ali Asani, talks a lot about, which I'm grateful to him for this, what he calls multisensory Islam. We think of the Quran as just a book, a physical book, but really initially the Quran was a recitation. And it is something to be heard and experienced as an event. Think about most people, most Muslims who don't speak Arabic or understand Arabic. I mean, I've been studying Arabic for years, but to actually like grasp it like I do English, I'm still not at that point. But still, when I hear the Arabic, it's something beautiful and it moves my spirit and my heart. So that's Quran as from the ear, from the auditory aspect. Then there's the visual aspect, Arabic calligraphy. Islamic architecture, that's kind of you're experiencing it. And then of course there's music, song, and dance. So the Sufis had this idea of sama. This is hearing or recitation. You heard the dhikr. And so they did this in a chanting or singing voice. And often they would use music and dance. Now, some of the sober ones would be opposed to it, but some of them would say it's okay for us to do it because we're spiritual elites. Yes, music is haram and dance is haram to the average commoner, but for us purified people, it's okay to engage in this. And now I did want to do some more some audiovisual on that note. So let's look at some of this. I mean, it's quite beautiful. So there's some of that. We have to go quickly, so I'll put these links up. And then go to the next one. Then there's dance, the famous whirling dervishes. You've all seen the whirling dervishes, so I'm not going to play this one because we're running out of time. But then there's qawwali. Qawwali, maybe you didn't know, is actually Sufi devotional music. It comes from the Arabic word qawl, or an utterance of the prophets. It has this divine kind of intonation to it. Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, he had all sorts of Sufi, oh, I didn't have the link yet, so let me put this up right here. So here's just to give you an idea of the lyrics. They're talking about Ali mostly. So this is quite, I mean, I love Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan's music. Some of the lyrics, again, push my boundaries, but I think it's quite beautiful music. And Ali Sethi, who is a pop artist in Pakistan, maybe some of you are familiar with him. He was talking about qawwali at a talk he gave at Harvard. He's very close to my advisor, Professor Asani. He was a student of his. And he says this comment that really stuck with me. He says, I didn't think that this counts as religious when he was a kid. But then when we start studying these things in the Western Academy, we realize that these actually have a profound religious connotation to the people who are engaging in them. So that leads us to a question: what counts as Islamic? There's Junoon, which is a Sufi rock band in Pakistan that blended kind of Western pop with Sufism. So let's watch this. Oh, very nice music. I like it quite a lot. And then let's move on. We're almost done. I know we're going a couple minutes past time. There was this covenant of love, Misak Ishq, which Ali Sethi, that I talked about, he put on. We'll skip this one just because that's my advisor right there. He's kind of cute, isn't he? That's my professor. And then what about, let's push the boundaries even further. What about punk Islam? You might have heard of taqwa core, the kominas, which is actually an Urdu word that you might know. Is this Islamic or is this not Islamic? Well, I would argue that they actually use subversive tropes, double entendres. There's even this hint of wine poetry in it that has its basis in the Islamic tradition. We saw this in some of the Sufi poetry that we saw, and they themselves would view it in this way, that is what they're doing. So let's take a look at some of this. So this is a song by them, also very catchy.
Tonight, a lot of people won't get no supper tonight. Just remember to kick it and praise Jehovah and kick it out.
So they're saying we're going to drink the same thing that we were drinking at Karbala. And I might not be doing my tafsir of this correctly, but I do think that there is a play on this element of wine that I think they're linking to the Islamic tradition, that this does exist. And in fact, if you find this uncomfortable or blasphemous, wait till you read something Hafez said, or I'm going to actually show you a book. So this stuff, this is not a divergence, but this is actually they're trying to ground themselves. They're putting one foot in the tradition and moving it one step further, trying to push the boundaries. So I find this as an expression of their Islamic piety. Whether you agree with it or not is a different story, but I'm just saying that this is part of our tradition, our vast tradition. So my final takeaway, this is my last slide, hopefully. Like Islam itself, Sufism is a vast tradition consisting of those who champion quote unquote orthodoxy and those who seek to subvert it, and all those in between. I contend that this vast richness and diversity should be a source of strength and possibility. And these are the books that I recommend. So on the top left, What is Islam? That is kind of, it's a difficult book to read. It's a huge book to read. But I think that will change your conception of how you interact with the Islamic tradition. So that was very influential in my way of thinking. Not that I agree with everything in it, but you want to expand your thinking. Sufism, an Introduction by Karl Ernst. That's a great starting point. If you want to know about the formative period, you have Clara Mustafa's book. If you want some primary source reading, then The Principles of Sufism by Aisha al-Bayuniya is a great book to read, and that's all about love. You see how central it is to Sufi conceptions. If you want to read some of that more blasphemous stuff that I was telling you, well, not blasphemous, but I mean like borderline, kind of pushing the limits, then Hafez and Faces of Love is a good one for you to read. Ahmed Safi's, that's a must buy for all of you. I hope every one of you goes on Amazon and orders that. That's an easy, quick read, good coffee table book to put up. And then Ghazali's book, The Marvels of the Heart. This one really did touch my heart. So even though I may be critical of many aspects of Sufism, there are things that I think are quite wise in the tradition and in Ghazali specifically. And then there's Qushayri's book, which is another primary source. So these are the kind of books I recommend, and I'll put these up. That is the end of my presentation. And now we will deal with questions, and hopefully we'll end in 5 to 10 minutes. So is there anybody who has another verbal question? Please let the moderator know. Sarabaji, if you could please, because I do want to intersperse verbal with written questions. All right. So the question here is from Nadim. Does Sufism oversimplify one aspect of God, love, forgiveness, and compassion, whereas Orthodox schools thought oversimplify towards other traits like fairness, justice, judgment, and in doing so creates an approach of permissiveness that then led to the slippery slope of undesired aspects in Islamo-Persian world? Good question. What I would say is that, again, it's important to realize that there's sober trends of Sufism that are very rigid when it comes to following the Sharia, and scrupulous. So they're all about sit for many long hours in prayer. So they would not be on the permissive side, but you could have the view that these other Sufis are being on the permissive side. So I think that's a question that is left up to you to answer. I think that we should embrace this kind of compassion, this vocabulary of compassion and love and forgiveness. I think it's a big part of the Quran that's been undervalued. So if anything, just to balance things out. Any verbal questions?
I think people want to know when iftar time is.
Until your sheikh says so. I haven't given you permission to scratch yourself or do anything.
Oh, we have a verbal question from Faisal. You can go ahead and speak.
Assalamu alaikum. It's more of a comment than a question, and I think that if you take things out of context in Quran, you can make the case for all this love and compassion and all these other things, and especially like wine and all these things are they are completely against Quran, right? So sure, all these things have their place in the Muslim tradition, but I don't think that they are Islamic tradition. So that's just a comment that I wanted to make.
I appreciate that. So that's why I said I do get disturbed by this kind of wine poetry. I definitely get disturbed by the pederasty, the bachabazi. So all those things that I put in red on that slide are things that I'm deeply uncomfortable with. So I do think they are part of the historical Islamic tradition, but whether they are part of the capital I Islamic tradition, that is that metaphysical concept that what we think is proper Islam, that is up to the individual believer. And like you, I would have my difference with it. Similarly with intermediation, I'm a big critic of it, but I can't deny that it is there historically in the tradition. Whether or not we take it as proper or not, that I think is left up to us. And I personally am uncomfortable with it, like you. And I'm definitely not advocating wine or alcohol. I absolutely believe it's forbidden. But I do think that even still, having it in our tradition, as far as our intellectual tradition is concerned, I think that this gives us a vastness and a richness so that we're not considered monolithic, so that we're not considered, in the West, there's this tendency to view Muslims as static, as not having diversity of opinion. So I think having that diversity of opinion, even if we specifically disagree on specific issues, is a good thing. And that's where I kind of stand on it. But thank you.
Agree. Thank you.
Is that it then? Okay. Sarabaji, is that it?
Yeah, you have a question on YouTube. It seems, I'll just read it to you. Does Sufism have a basis in Quran or Sunnah? I think this is kind of the foundational stuff that you covered at the beginning, though.
Right, and again, I can't answer that question. That is a religious question that each person has to make that decision themselves. I would say that Ghamidi Saab says no to that. I would say, and probably he has more complexity in his answer, so you have to go direct to the source. I would say from my standpoint, I think they're pulling things from the Islamic sources, but they may go in different directions. And I think most groups and everybody really does that. That's my view. Is that it?
Two more questions.
Okay.
You have two more questions. One from,
because we don't want to go more than 15 minutes.
Sorry, can you take a couple more?
Yeah, we'll take a couple more and then we'll end it because we don't want to go more than 15 minutes.
Okay, just two more. One from Hassan Osmani and then one from Nadeem Sayed, and then we'll call it a day.
Okay. And why don't you give me both of them?
One is a verb. They're both verbal questions.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Hassan, uncle, please go ahead.
Oh, by the way, great lecture.
Thank you,
But
sir.
on the Islamic tradition part, right? I mean, we cannot forget. So I'm going to make a comment rather than a question. So the wahi comes to the Prophet while he's meditating in Ghar Hira. So when people ask, is it, Islamic tradition or not, the very emergence of Islam in terms of wahi coming is in part of a meditative state. And so one should keep that in mind when one is kind of thinking about these things, that very much going away from the world and doing meditation and trying to discover the divine or the answer to life in some ways is very much part of the Prophet's own life. I think the other comment is that I think some, chaplain had talked about the political issue, but I think you alluded to it in terms of it's not so much just a political issue, but the mazhabs as they emerged got so involved in kind of looking at finer and finer distinctions between what was halal and what was haram and what was makruh and what was, that they got so pulled into it that some parts of Muslim Ummah just said, this is not bringing us any closer to God. It's just bringing us into, non-stop discussion about, so we're losing the forest for the trees kind of thing. And so Sufism is a direct, is one reaction. I mean, it has its roots also in the mystical tradition, but it also has its reaction to a very legalistic form of Islam, which the mazhabs, in a sense, in their logical evolution, became so involved in jurisprudence issues that they were losing sight of the spiritual aspect of it. And so Sufism goes into that side. So just, I just wanted to, add that to the discussion.
I appreciate that. I agree with both of your points. Thank you so much, Hassan.
This is a quick question. This is the last question for today from Nadeem Sayed. Did Sufis use alcohol the way many creatives use psychedelics today?
So I would say yes, the drunk Sufis did, and the sober Sufis still use this wine language, but in a metaphorical sense. So they didn't actually imbibe wine. And then there was also this double entendre where it's left vague or ambiguous whether it means actual wine or God intoxication or both. And often it means both. So they're straddling this limit of acceptability. So any last, I think we can do one more of, if somebody wants to use a video question. No? Okay, we'll call it a day. Your Sheikh, bless you and let you go. But please make sure to upload video responses and put them on the class Google Classroom if you can. I would appreciate that. Your Sheikh commands you thus. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.